"This is what you deserve." Those were the words. They hung in the air of the cavernous dining room, sharp and cold as the November night. I stared at my plate, at the fine, hand-painted porcelain, now desecrated by the saliva of Eleanora Beaumont, my daughter-in-law's mother. 15 people witnessed the act. 15 pairs of eyes, all belonging to the powerful and the privileged, watched in silence as the 65-year-old matriarch, draped in a pearl-colored Chanel suit, leaned across the mahogany table and spat on my food as if I were something scraped from the bottom of her shoe. It was a grotesque, theatrical act of contempt. But what truly shattered me, what broke through the numbness and pierced my very soul, was not the spittle. It was the voice of my son. "Mom, please. Behave yourself. Don't provoke her." Julian. My Julian, the boy I had raised alone, the child for whom I had scrubbed other people's floors to pay for his college textbooks. The man who now looked at me not with defense, but with pure, unadulterated embarrassment. He was begging me to be quiet, pleading with me to swallow this final vile humiliation, to not shatter the fragile illusion of his perfect life at this opulent autumn gala. In that instant, something inside me didn't just break, it calcified. It hardened into something cold, heavy, and absolute. My hands, which I expected to be trembling, were perfectly still. I reached into my small, worn handbag. I took out my phone. My fingers moved with a calm I didn't recognize as my own. I typed 3 words. I pressed send, execute the plan. Eleonora let out a brittle laugh, a sound like glass shattering. "Who are you texting, Adeline? Your little sewing circle? Are they going to come and save you?" I rose slowly from my chair. I blotted my lips with the heavy linen napkin. I looked directly into her cold, victorious eyes and spoke with a voice that was no longer mine. It was clear, measured, and devoid of all heat. "My lawyers?" What happened next, no one saw coming. "My name is Adeline Monroe. I am 58 years old. For most of my life, I was the invisible woman. I was the sacrificing mother, the compliant shadow, the humble tailor who always bowed her head. But that night, in front of that imported mahogany table and under the light of a crystal chandelier, I was reminded of something I had long forgotten about myself. Humility does not mean annihilation. And the quietest woman in the room is often the one preparing the most devastating move. Let me tell you how a simple tailor from South Boston ended up at that table, and how that same tailor taught them all a lesson they will carry to their graves. 3 years ago, my life was a quiet symphony of small things, but it was mine. I lived in a small row house in a working-class Boston neighborhood with a tiny yard full of defiant purple petunias and a sewing workshop that smelled of clean fabric and Singer machine oil. My world was measured in yards of twill and the loyal hum of my machine. I would rise at dawn, make my coffee, and watch the sun illuminate the world. My life was small, yes, but it was honest. I mended hems, designed prom dresses, and embroidered linens for local weddings. My clients were women like me, nurses, teachers, waitresses. They paid me with crumpled bills and always, always treated me with respect. "Adeline," they would say, "you have hands of gold." I didn't have much, but I had dignity. And I had Julian, my son, my pride, the man who had achieved everything I never could. I had scrubbed floors and worked double shifts, sewing until my fingers bled, to push him through Boston College. He graduated with honors, landed a coveted job at a high-end real estate firm in Manhattan, and began his ascent. I watched him climb, my heart a painful paradox of pride and loss. Every rung he climbed, every tailored suit he wore, was a rung I had built with my own raw, chapped hands. I thought the sacrifice was the price of his happiness. I never imagined it was the price of him. The day Julian brought Serafina home, I knew something had changed. He came without warning. I was in the yard, kneeling in the dirt, wearing my old apron. "Mom," he said, that nervous smile I knew so well, "I want you to meet someone." Serafina Beaumont was a creature of impossible beauty, tall, slender, with a polished sheen that only comes from generations of effortless wealth. She extended 2 perfect, manicured fingers. "A pleasure, Mrs. Monroe." Her smile was correct, but her eyes were cold. "Please, call me Adeline," I said, wiping my dirt-stained hands on my apron. Come in, I'll make coffee. I saw her glance at Julian, a quick, almost imperceptible flicker that said, This? This is where you came from? I served coffee in my mismatched mugs. Serafina held hers with her fingertips, as if afraid of catching poverty. Mom, Julian said, taking her hand, we have news. We're getting married. My heart stuttered. Joy, and a sharp, sudden dread. Oh, Julian, that's wonderful. I moved to hug him, then her. Serafina, welcome to the family. She smiled that bloodless smile. Thank you, Adeline. Julian has told me so much about you, about your job. The way she said job felt like a pinprick. I'm a tailor, I said, my chin rising, and proud of it. Of course, she replied, the smile never wavering. It's a very humble profession. Julian said nothing. That night, after they left, I sat in front of my sewing machine and cried, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps because, for the first time, my son had looked at me through her eyes. 2 weeks later, I was invited to meet her family. The Beaumont estate in Newport, Rhode Island, wasn't a house. It was a monument to a dynasty. A uniformed butler opened a door that was taller than my entire first floor. Mrs. Monroe, they are waiting for you on the terrace. I walked through marble hallways, my worn shoes squeaking on the polished floor. I clutched the carrot cake I had baked since 5 that morning. On the terrace, Eleanora Beaumont, Serafina's mother, held court like a winter queen. She was draped in cashmere, examining me from head to toe as I approached. Mom? Julian said. This is my mom, Adeline. How lovely, Eleanora said, her voice like chimes of ice. She did not stand. Please, sit. I brought a dessert, I said, holding up the cake. A carrot cake. It's my specialty. Time. Eleanora looked at it as if I had presented her with a roadkill. What a thoughtful gesture. Daniela, she called to a maid. Take this to the kitchen. The cake vanished. We never saw it again. For 2 hours, I sat there, an awkward ornament. They spoke of regattas, of acquisitions, of wines I couldn't pronounce. No one asked me a single question. When we left, Eleanora brushed my cheek with air. Adeline, she said, her smile all needles. How sweet that Julian has such simple roots. It makes him so authentic. In the car, Julian was silent. Aren't they incredible, Mom? He finally asked. Yes, son, I said, looking out the window. Incredible. Slowly, Julian began to change. He no longer visited on Sundays. He stopped calling me Mommy. It became Mom, formal and distant. One day, I asked him, Julian, are you ashamed of me? He almost choked on his coffee. What? Of course not. Then why do I feel like you're polishing me away? He stirred his coffee. Mom, Serafina's family. They're different. They have certain standards. I have to fit in. It's complicated. I see, I said, standing up so he wouldn't see the tears. I understand perfectly, but I didn't. I only knew the boy who swore he'd buy me a big house one day, now looked at me like I was a problem he had to solve. The wedding was in June. I sewed my own dress, a simple navy silk. When I arrived, I saw the ocean of designer gowns and jewels. I was an intruder. Eleanora, in a massive hat, glided over. Adeline, you look lovely. Did you make that yourself? Yes, Mrs. Beaumont. Oh, how clever. For the next important event, I can recommend an excellent boutique. I was seated at a table in the back, far from the bridal party. I watched my son laugh, toast, and merge with a world that I could never touch. When it was time for the mother-son dance, he held me, but he felt stiff. Mom, he whispered, thank you for everything. I'll never forget it. I just want you to be happy, my love. I am. Serafina is incredible. Her family. They've opened so many doors for me. He didn't realize that in opening those doors, he was closing the one to me. After the wedding, the calls became rarer. They moved into a townhouse on the Upper East Side, a wedding gift from the Beaumonts. I remained in my little house, sewing, waiting. 6 months later, Julian called. his voice bright. "Mom, news. Serafina's pregnant. You're going to be a grandmother." My heart leaped. "Oh, Julian, I'm coming over." "Wait, Mom. I'll call you to coordinate. She's resting. And, her mom is here, organizing everything." The call to coordinate never came. I watched the pregnancy on social media, extravagant baby showers, designer nurseries. I sat in my workshop, knitting a small blue blanket, wondering if my grandson would ever be allowed to wear it. When Leo was born, I was summoned to the hospital. The private suite was overflowing with opulent flower arrangements. Serafina was radiant. Julian was holding the baby. And standing guard, like a sentinel, was Eleonora. "Sophie," Julian said. He had started using my old nickname Sophie, just like they did. "Look, Mom, your grandson." I approached, my eyes full of tears. He was perfect. Can I hold him?" Julian looked at Serafina. Serafina looked at Eleonora. Eleonora nodded, a queen granting a boon. "Of course, Adeline, but be careful, he's very delicate." As if my hands, the ones that had raised a man, were suddenly unclean. I held Leo, breathing in that impossible new baby smell. "I brought you a blanket," I whispered. "I made it myself." Eleonora stepped forward. She examined the knitting. "How charmingly rustic. Although, Adeline, these hand knits often have fibers that can irritate a newborn's skin. We'd best put it away. We're only using the imported organic cotton." It was a slap. Julian said nothing. I stayed for 20 minutes. No one offered me a seat. When I left, Julian walked me to the elevator. "Mom, if you need help." "Don't worry, Mom. Eleonora has it all covered. She's moving in for the first few weeks." Of course she was. I returned to my empty house, the second-class grandmother. The next few months were a slow, silent torture. I saw photos of Leo constantly in Eleonora's arms, at Beaumont parties I wasn't invited to. One day, I went to their house unannounced. A maid answered. "Do you have an appointment?" "An appointment? To see my son?" Serafina appeared, holding Leo. "Adeline, you should have called. We have a very strict nap routine." I held my grandson for 15 minutes. Serafina watched me like a hawk. "Adeline, not so close to your face. You never know what germs you're carrying." I left. That night, I looked at my sewing machine. That old singer, the one that had paid for his college, his dreams, and I wondered if it had been worth it. I had hit rock bottom, but life was about to send me a lifeline. The call came 3 months later, an unknown number. "Mrs. Adeline Monroe. Speaking. This is Marcus Thorne, from Thorne and Associates. I need to see you urgently. It concerns a delicate family matter." I thought Julian was dead. "Is my son okay?" "Your son is fine. This concerns your late husband, Arthur Monroe." I froze. I hadn't spoken that name in 30 years. Arthur, the man who had walked out when Julian was 2, vanishing into the ether. The lawyer's office was on the 50th floor, all glass and steel. Marcus Thorne was a kind man with sharp eyes. "Mrs. Monroe, your ex-husband Arthur passed away 6 months ago in Miami." I felt nothing. "I'm sorry to hear that." "Ma'am, Arthur changed in his later years. He regretted leaving. He built a successful import-export business. And in his will, he left everything to his son, Julian, and his grandson, Leo." The world tilted. "Julian inherited?" "Yes, we're talking approximately $5 million. $5 million. Does Julian know?" "Yes, ma'am. He and his wife came in 5 months ago to sign the papers." 5 months. He had known for 5 months. While I was sewing until 2 a.m. to make rent. "Why? Why are you telling me this?" Mr. Thorne sighed. "Because Arthur also left a letter. For you." He handed me an envelope. Arthur's handwriting was shaky. "Adeline, I know I deserve no forgiveness. I left you with our boy and ran. I built a life, but I was never free of the guilt. I leave everything to Julian, because you, with your love and your labor, raised him. But I beg him, never abandon you as I did. Take care of your mother. Give her the place she deserves." Tears stained the ink. "Mrs. Monroe," the lawyer continued, The reason I called. Julian made me sign documents ensuring absolute discretion. He did not want you to know about this inheritance. My son had deliberately hidden this. There's more, Mr. Thorne said, sliding a folder across the desk. He and his wife have been making significant purchases. A country home in the Hamptons, a new BMW, a donation of $150,000 to a foundation presided over by Mrs. Eleanora Beaumont. He has never, to my knowledge, offered you any assistance. I left that office like a sleepwalker. I walked through Midtown in a daze. He hadn't just hidden it. He had actively, consciously erased me, all while spending his father's guilt money to impress the very people who despised me. That night, I looked up Serafina's social media. There it was. The house in the Hamptons, our little getaway, the new car. Hubby spoiled me. A photo from a gala, proud to support the Beaumont Hope Foundation. I closed the laptop. The woman who had cried herself to sleep was gone. In her place was something cold and sharp. Clarity. I called Julian. Mom, everything okay? Julian, I need to see you. Today. He came that night. He brought Serafina. Son, I said, I want you to be honest with me. Your father passed away, didn't he? Julian's face went white. How? How did you know? He left you an inheritance. A heavy, suffocating silence. Yes, he finally admitted. He left us some resources. $5 million is some resources. Why did you hide it, Julian? I didn't want to hurt you, Mom, remembering him, and I didn't want you to think I valued his money over what you did for me. He was a bad liar. And his final request? The letter? The one where he begged you to take care of me? Serafina stepped in. Adeline, this is a private matter for our nuclear family. We didn't want to involve you in complicated finances. I am his mother. Mom, please, Julian begged. We were planning to help you, to renovate your house. When? In 5 years? After you bought the Hamptons house? The BMW? The donation to Eleonora's foundation? Serafina stood, offended. I don't know who you've been talking to, Adeline, but it is highly inappropriate for you to be investigating our finances. Inappropriate, I whispered, is forgetting the mother who broke her back so you could have this life. I want you to leave, I said, my voice flat. Leave my house. When I closed the door, I did not cry. I sat in my workshop. The war hadn't started yet, but I had just put on my uniform. The next few weeks, I changed. I called my clients. I informed them my prices were doubling. Some left. Most, the ones who valued my work, stayed. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving. I was earning. I had found my value. Then, 2 weeks later, an invitation. A call from Serafina. Adeline, my mother is having a small, intimate dinner. Her birthday. Robert insists you come. They were using my son as bait. It's formal, Adeline. You know, elegant. The message was clear. Don't show up looking like a seamstress. I sewed my own dress. Black silk, elegant, severe. That night, I walked into the Beaumont mansion. Eleanora, dripping in diamonds, sneered. Adeline, what a unique dress. Did you make it? Yes, Mrs. Beaumont. It shows, she said. It has that handcrafted touch. I was seated at the end of the table, a ghost. After dinner, I went to the restroom. As I returned, I heard voices from the study. Eleonora, Serafina, and Julian. You have to set boundaries, Julian, Eleonora was saying. Your mother is a burden. You saw how she reacted to the inheritance. She's resentful. She's not a burden, Eleonora. Julian's voice was weak. Darling, be realistic, Serafina chimed in. She's intense. She makes things awkward. We have to think of Leo. Children need to be around. Sophisticated environments, not mediocrity. And, Eleonora added, now that you're pregnant again, you need peace, not this drama. Pregnant. Again. They hadn't even told me. I returned to my seat, my legs trembling. Julian returned, avoiding my eyes. Coward. I drove home, but I did not cry. I sat at my machine, and I made a decision. I picked up my phone and called Marcus Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," I said, "I need legal advice regarding inheritances, family fraud, and grandparental rights. When can you see me?" "Tomorrow at 10, Mrs. Monroe. I'll be waiting." The next day, Mr. Thorne laid out the options. We could sue for grandparent visitation. The inheritance was trickier, but the letter provided moral leverage. "I don't want his money," I said. "I want respect." "Sometimes, Mrs. Monroe," he said, "to get respect, you must hit them where it hurts, their money and their reputation." That afternoon, Julian showed up at my house, alone. He looked haunted. "Mom, I need a huge favor. I need you to sign some papers." He placed them on my cutting table. "It's a voluntary renunciation of visitation rights for Leo." The world stopped. "What?" "It's just a formality, Mom. For the new baby's trust, the lawyers just need all the grandparents to sign off." "Did Eleonora sign this?" "It's different. She's involved. Well, you hardly see him. Please, Mom, just sign." I read the document. It wasn't a formality. It was a legal declaration that I, Adeline Monroe, was emotionally and financially unfit to be a part of my grandchildren's lives. It was my legal execution. "No," I said. "What?" "I will not sign this." "Mom, you don't understand." He stood, agitated. "If you don't sign, Serafina and her family, things are going to get complicated. Eleonora can be difficult." "Are you threatening me, Julian?" "I'm warning you." "Get out," I whispered. "Get out of my house." He left. I slid to the floor, the foundation of my life gone. At 3 a.m., my phone buzzed, an unknown number. "Mrs. Monroe, this is Maria, an employee at the Beaumont house. We need to talk. We have things you need to know, things they are planning against you." We met in a cafe. Maria and Daniela, two of the household staff. "Mrs. Monroe," Maria said, "what they are doing is not right." She handed me a phone with earbuds. "We recorded this." I pressed play. It was Eleonora's voice, cold and clear. "If she won't sign, we'll have to take other measures. I have a lawyer preparing documents to prove she's unfit. We'll use her precarious economic situation. We can get a fabricated psychological evaluation." Serafina's voice, "But is that legal?" Eleonora's laugh. "Darling, everything is legal if you have enough money. She lives hand-to-mouth sewing dresses. What lawyer can she afford? She has nothing." My blood turned to ice. They weren't just excluding me. They were conspiring to destroy me. "Why?" I asked the two women. "Why risk your jobs?" "Because we are mothers too," Daniela said. "And besides, you were always kind to us. You asked about our families. They don't even look us in the eye. You have a heart, Mrs. Monroe. They only have money." I walked out into the park, gasping for air. "I'm going to fight," I said. That afternoon, I was back in Marcus Thorne's office. "I have evidence," I said, placing the phone on his desk. He listened, his kind eyes hardened. "This isn't just a family dispute, Mrs. Monroe. This is a criminal conspiracy." He made a call. "I'm bringing in my litigation team, and I'm going to investigate the Beaumont family finances." Eleonora said, "You have nothing. She's about to find out how wrong she is." The following Saturday, the invitation came, the annual autumn gala at the Beaumont estate. "It's a trap," I told Marcus. "I know," he said. "It's also an opportunity. Go, be calm. Whatever happens, I have mechanisms in place. We just need them to show their true colors in front of witnesses." And so I arrived. I walked into that mansion wearing a simple navy dress, my head held high. I was seated at the end of the table. The ghost. The dinner began, the chatter, the champagne. Eleonora waited until the main course. "Adeline," she said, her voice silencing the table. "It's so good you could come. I know you've been difficult lately. Julian told us you refused to sign a simple paper." I kept my voice calm. "I refused to renounce my rights as a grandmother." Eleonora laughed. "Oh, Adeline, always so dramatic. Let me be direct. You and I come from different worlds. My family values excellence. You You do what you can. These children are Beaumonts. They deserve to grow up in an environment of prestige, not mediocrity. I raised Julian alone, I said, my voice firm. I educated him. I gave him values. If that is mediocrity to you, then I am proud to be mediocre. Values? She sneered. He had to unlearn all that when he entered our family. You need to understand your place, Adeline. Your place is in that little house with your little machine. Leave the important things to us. And what does Julian think? I asked, looking at my son. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Mom, he mumbled. It's what's best. You are a burden, Adeline, Eleonora said, her voice dropping, thick with venom. She stood. She walked to my end of the table. She loomed over me. An emotional burden Julian no longer needs to carry. And then, in front of 15 witnesses, she leaned down and spat on my plate. The saliva landed on the beef fillet. The silence was absolute. This, Eleonora hissed, is what you deserve. No one moved. No one breathed. And then, my son, my Julian. Mom, please, behave yourself. Don't provoke her. That was the moment. The final betrayal. My hands were steady. I took out my phone. I sent the text. Execute the plan. Eleonora laughed. Who are you texting? Your sewing circle? I stood up. I wiped my mouth. My lawyers. Her smile faltered. You can't afford. You are mistaken, Eleonora. I have several. And they are already on their way, with court orders. And some very interesting questions about financial fraud. Her husband, Ernest, shot to his feet. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the $1.8 million of my son's inheritance that you convinced him to invest in your company. Investments, my lawyers discovered, were phantoms. Money you used to cover your own massive debts. Julian went white. What? No, Ernest said. They used you, Julian. They stole from you. That's a lie, Eleonora shrieked. At that exact moment, the doorbell rang. Maria opened it. 3 men in dark suits entered. Marcus Thorne stepped forward. Good evening, he said. We have documents to serve on Mr. Ernest Beaumont and Mr. Julian Monroe. An emergency injunction freezing assets pending a criminal fraud investigation. This is ridiculous, Ernest blustered. Is it? Marcus asked. He placed a small speaker on the table. We also have this, courtesy of 2 very honest employees. He pressed play. Eleonora's voice filled the dining room. Prove she's unfit. Fabricated psychological evaluation. She has no money. She has nothing. The faces around the table turned to stone. And, Marcus continued, we have the false reports you already filed. That is perjury. That is conspiracy. You didn't just underestimate Adeline Monroe, Mrs. Beaumont. You broke the law. Serafina looked at her mother, horrified. Mom, is this true? Eleonora was silent, her perfect mask shattered. I walked to my son. He was sitting, head in his hands, his body shaking. Julian, I said softly, you were given a choice. You chose them. You chose their money, their status. You chose to humiliate me, to erase me. Mom, I didn't know. You knew, I said. You knew they were hurting me, and you looked the other way. Forgive me, he wept. I can't. Not now. I turned to the room. This family took my son, my grandson, and my peace, but they could not take my self-worth. I walked to the door. Before leaving, I looked back at Eleonora. You spat on my plate and said it was what I deserved. Life has a funny way of balancing the scales, Eleonora. I think you are about to receive exactly what you deserve. I left that house with my head held high. Outside, under the cold stars, I finally allowed myself to tremble. The aftermath was swift. The Beaumont empire, built on lies, collapsed. Ernest, facing jail time, turned on his wife. Their assets were seized. The mansion was foreclosed. Julian, having lost his inheritance and his dignity, was broken. Serafina, realizing the monster her mother was and the man her husband had become, left them both. But the war was over. I had won. I had a court order for visitation with Leo. Robert and Serafina, humbled and bankrupt, eventually found their way back to each other. They moved into a small apartment, one they could actually afford. Robert found a new job, one he earned. They started therapy. Eleonora lost everything. Her husband, her daughter, her status, her money. The last I heard, she was working in a boutique, the very kind she used to despise. The road to healing with Julian was long. It was not a single conversation, but 1,000 small, painful ones. There were apologies, there were tears. He had to earn back my trust, stitch by stitch. He had to prove he was the man I raised, not the one they had molded. This morning, I was in my workshop. The petunias are in full bloom. My new granddaughter, Miranda, was asleep in her bassinet, and Leo, now 6, was sitting beside me, learning to thread a needle. "Grandma," he asked, "is sewing hard?" "It just takes patience, my love," I told him, "and a steady hand." The bell rang. It was Robert and Serafina. They brought coffee. We sat in my small kitchen, the 4 of us. It was not a perfect family. The scars were still there, but it was real. I learned that night that justice is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet, methodical work of a needle. Sometimes it is the courage of 2 women risking their jobs for what is right. And sometimes it is the simple, unbreakable dignity of a woman who refuses to be erased. They had tried to bury me. They had spat on my name and called me mediocre. They didn't realize that in trying to destroy me, they had given me the one thing I lacked, a reason to fight. They forgot that I am a tailor. I know that from the smallest, most discarded scraps, you can build something strong, something beautiful, and something that lasts. You just have to know where to place the first stitch.